this organization, this summit, is trying to identify 2 or 3 things that would be action steps. There's been some mentioned already. In watching the 3 videotapes, it becomes clear that when you get the community together, when you get those leaders in the room, and you get that kind of that cross discussion that you're talking about, that you come up with dozens and dozens of ideas. And then in each community, the most appropriate 2 or 3 things will probably vary. They'll be different. How does one go about the process of identifying within each of those communities the 2 or 3 most prioritized things that can get accomplished, that can then, because if you get things accomplished, you get momentum. And with momentum, you get progress. So how do you identify those 2 or 3 things that are workable? And maybe you have some suggestions on what those precise 2 or 3 things ought to be for this group. 2-part question. Each of you.
You want to go first?
Well, coming out of a movement, a bottom-up grassroots movement called the Environmental Justice Movement that I've been working with for the last 30 years, we like to say that the first principle, there are 17 principles of environmental justice, and the first principle is that people must speak for themselves, and the most impacted must determine what the priorities are. And so since I subscribe to that principle in terms of environmental justice, I think the same would probably apply here, in that there's so much indigenous knowledge within those communities that have emerged out of some histories that under normal circumstances many peoples would not survive. And so having indigenous knowledge and getting from those communities what they see as their needs and their priorities, and respecting that, I think that to me would be a first start. And then, even though some of the community leaders may have a rough sketch of policies and procedures and the kinds of institutional changes, they may have just a rough idea. I think it would be one of the functions of, quote, the experts, to take that and to see where the levers are and where the hooks are that you can hang those things on to meld it into a operational kind of a reality. Short of that, I think it would be superimposing and a top-down model, which I think we've seen over many years and enough, and I've had enough experience to fill at least 15 books of that stuff. It won't work. So get the information from the people and take that and work in a collaborative way from on the front end, in the middle, and all the way through to make it a reality. And that's where I think a good partnership, not a junior partner, not a silent partner, but an equal partner, can have something that'll be workable.
I think if you have a little bit of money, which apparently you guys do, it's useful to spend some of that with a facilitator that's done that kind of thing before elsewhere. Like I said, Gamaliel, they basically provide technical assistance to affiliates. They've spent a lot of time learning how to do grassroots organization right in a way where people feel like their voices are heard, but also when ultimately they settle on priorities. So I would find, some of the experts who've done this elsewhere well, and pay those people to come in and facilitate a similar process. If you're trying to identify priorities on the ground in a community, and I would not pretend to have the expertise to identify, what I think strategically those priorities ought to be.
We'll open it up to questions now from the audience. Comments, questions. They've made numerous exceptional points. I would love your input.
idea of 40 acres and a mule fit in this day's society?
40 acres and a mule, the concept is still a concept that I think we need to aspire to achieve, and I think the lawsuit of the black farmers and the damage that was done by USDA and the refusal of the Senate right now, not 50 years ago, not 100 years ago, but 3 days ago, not to grant the justice to the black farmers. Now, I've been working with a number of black landowners in the South whose land is being taken, stolen by contamination. You know, in Tennessee, this black family, not 40 acres and a mule, but owns 150 acres and no mule. It was not granted by the government. They got this land, you know, 6 generations. They've owned it for 6 generations. The idea is that land has always been enough for, and important enough for people to fight wars over. The fact that we still have, African Americans still own land, and most of it is still in the South. We have black farmers. A lot of these farms are located next to cities. We talk about food deserts. We talk about not having access to healthy foods. We talk about sustainable agriculture. We talk about green economy. There's land, there's capital, there's potential. We talk about historically black colleges and universities. Many of them are located in the South, 95% of them, and the resources that could be provided to communities that are struggling with land ownership, property. A house, when you buy a house, that's the largest investment that most families will make. And if you look at the wealth gap between whites and black families' wealth is about 10% of what white families. And the reason of that is where our wealth is concentrated. Black people own 50% of black people own their homes, but about 75% of whites. 60% of the wealth of white families is in their home. The other 40% is expanded into the different portfolio, businesses, stocks and portfolios, etc. 90% of our wealth is in our houses, is in our home. We don't own a whole lot of stock. So when our homes go into foreclosure, we lose 90% of our wealth. And so 40 acres and a mule right now is that we have to understand that we have to gain more wealth and ownership. Business, houses, property, and other kinds of investment, and it has to be solid. So we have to make sure that predatory lending is stopped. Yeah. Most of the families who bought homes during this crisis could have qualified for conventional loans, and our communities were targeted. That is theft. That is targeting our communities and killing our communities. That redlining. And so we have to, so as communities go down and people lose their houses, lose their jobs, lose their health, all of this is destructive to our communities. And so we have to talk about how we're going to reinvigorate. So the business school has to work with the School of Public Health. The School of Public Health has to work with the sociology department, who can do the GIS analysis and the mapping and do the power, analysis. So it's still relevant today. If you don't own anything, you can lose your house and lose your job, and you become a landless proletariat.
I'll just say, add to that, if you had better organization, better mobile, and the Gamaliel affiliates are so organized that they can overnight, through their email networks, get 2,000 to 5,000 people to show up at a hearing the next day. And that kind of ability to mobilize people to get in the face of decision makers makes a difference. So, I consider myself a relatively sophisticated person, and I wasn't aware that the Senate hadn't, moved on this for 3 days. So, the black farmers, God bless them, they need, political capital behind them too. So I just really want to underscore that whatever your policy agenda, be it, protecting land or whatever, you do need to have your troops organized.
You have a question right over here?
How can we go even beyond the level of the college students or the academicians talking together to making sure that the young younger generations, those that are going to carry the legacy on, are better prepared to deal with these issues that are going to be left for them to face at some point in time?
Well, that's an easy one for me because I consider myself a change agent. My department of sociology at Clark Atlanta was founded by W.E.B. Du Bois. I have an endowed chair in that department. My university was founded by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 to educate former slaves, so I know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I left UCLA in 1994 to go back to an historically black college university to train young African Americans, this next generation of leaders and next generation of change agents and scholars and shakers and doers. I think we have to understand that each generation has to take on a different level of the issues that we're talking about. And I think the idea of this talk about green careers and green jobs and this green economy, I think we have to have young people involved and mobilized to understand what it means when this economy is changing dramatically before our eyes. And so that we can't leave any of our schools behind. We can't just say, well, this school is in the urban inner city in the ghetto, and therefore we don't need to have math and science in the school. All of our schools need to be magnet schools, need to be high-performing schools, need to be schools where kids are challenged. I mean, a report just came out 4 days ago. Yes, we can report, and looking at black males not graduating, and looking at the places where the worst. That's a national disgrace to look at the school systems where young black males, the numbers graduating in some cases 25%, 30% are graduating from high school. That's a national security issue, and we should treat it as one, and not just as a throwaway, let's not take it as part of a priority. That's a major concern. So each generation takes on the issue and carries it to the next level and owns it.
Even what you said with the schools, like here in Birmingham, the school that was really performing for 6 years in the whole United States, made the top 100 schools. The first thing they did was they shut the school down because they said it was 723 students there. But all the studies say that smaller schools make better students. But when you affect a black community like this, you study an issue to death. Every time a grant come in, what they do a study instead of using the study that was before theirs. Putting the money into the community to educate the people. That's what they are not doing. They are skipping over the people that's actually in the community. How to mobilize a group of people when they don't have computers, when they don't have the internet. You have 6 at the library, but when 99 neighborhoods have the newsletter, and you see that they're mobilizing with that newsletter, what the first thing you do, you cut the newsletter off to where they can't mobilize. So when you start affecting black communities like this, it's no way that you can succeed. They set you up to fail. And that's why it's so important that we do vote. It's so important that we do vote and that we do mobilize and that we got to get the word out. And even if you're working in a community, if you're not living there, you still don't have a clue because you will not get all the information. And if you live in a community and not living outside your house, you still don't have a clue. You have to get up and you have to go door to door. You got to talk to people. You got to find out what's going on in your neighborhood. From Center Street to Piggly Wiggly in West End, on Tuscaloosa Avenue, we have 6,000 residents. 6,000. That's not including 60,000 people in one community. And we have very lack of internet access. In the library, only have so many computers there. So is it they're trying not to inform us to make sure that we're not educated on these issues? It's a setup. It's purposely being done. Racism is still here. You know, we have to be honest about this. People come in, they write grants. The neighborhood and community never see a dime of it. They never get any benefits out of it. You know, it's just the truth. And that's what we need to stop hiding around here. We need to tell and let people know the truth about the situation.
I think you're exactly right. And when you look at the way that the communication tree operates, and neighborhood associations and civic clubs and homeowners association, the ones that are strongest are the ones that have the best communication plan and strategy and can implement. They have a rapid deployment kind of operation. If somebody's trying to put something next door, I mean, it goes into action. Whereas if you're not organized and if you don't have a system where you can mobilize, something can be put in a neighborhood, or school can be closed, or a grocery store or whatever can be closed, and the community will hear about it, too late, or after the fact. I think in the absence of having, the technology, there still has to be organizing low-tech, door-to-door, telephone. If you got a landline or if you got a cell phone, you can't opt out and say, well, we ain't got a computer. I think the fact there's no substitute for organizing. I work with lots of groups around the country, and these groups are oftentimes under-resourced. But the dedication is there. When something, little old grandmothers in tennis shoes, take no prisoner type, Marine Corps type, retired school teachers, there's no substitute for it. When you get them riled up, they are talking about coming together and protecting their grandchildren. And so I think the organizing model and the mobilizing model and the grassroots bottom-up approach, and to make sure that people understand that our community is not for sale and it's not to be dumped on and it's not to be taken lightly. When that kind of respect and that kind of tenacity is built in, people will start thinking twice about just, oh, you can take them for granted, you can put it over here, or you can just ignore, you can just close that school and nobody's going to not peep. They're just renters. They're not homeowners. They don't have a stake. Even if you are a renter, you have a stake in what's happening in the community. When you start putting that overlay there, then I think that's an empowerment model I think there's no substitute for. It works.
And it's self-empowerment.
Yes.
I just want to underscore that every community, I don't care how disadvantaged, how poor, every community has the assets of indigenous leaders. And, if you don't organize, you'll get more of the same.
How do we involve our scholars, our black scholars, to reinvest back into their own community, where they came from, you see, because they got out by grants or whatever, but they don't come back. And they start making some money, then they talk black, but they invest white. That's because we're there. So we have to begin to address that. The fact is that we're not all broke. Many of our folk eat fish, but they're not getting that. Okay? So at some point, I wish, because I really like what you're saying about, or what you're talking about, but we got to begin to activate, because hot air, you got to begin to do something. And I'm extremely interested in making something happen as the directors of this summer. Oh, we're going to do something. But I just want to say something about that scholar, if you can.
Well, I don't know if it takes scholars, but I know so many young African-American professionals, I'm talking about the D.C. area because that's where I live now, where they affirmatively choose to go to black neighborhoods. Some people call them transitional neighborhoods, but they choose to go to neighborhoods where there are black folks and want to be involved. Often the housing is cheaper there. I don't know if that's happening in your neighborhood, but I do see the willingness and the open-mindedness of people to rethink, coming back home. And all I can say is, that community, you may need to do some concerted outreach, to reach out to people, to let people know what's great about your community. But I'll say this, it's really interesting to see often the resistance and hostility that, frankly, we're being honest, right? That low-income black people sometimes have to higher-income black people coming into their neighborhood. It's fascinating to watch, you know. And it's,
Yeah,
But it's why. Once you understand why that's there, then you can begin to remove the barriers. But you just can't look at the problem and not try to develop a solution.
well, yeah, you need forums where people can work on things together and get to know each other and break down barriers of mistrust.
let me try to deal with that in a way. Oops.
This lady's been trying to get in here.
I just want to say, I don't think that is a race problem, because I see the same thing in all the communities. I mean, it's white and black in Wilcox County. Get away, get out. You think you've succeeded by getting out and going somewhere larger. I see it in black and white coming back. It's about community and pride.
Let me show you what the research really shows.
That's what I want to know.
The research shows middle-income African Americans and low-income African Americans don't live that far apart. Segregation. Black middle-class folks are segregated also. Upper middle-income African American neighborhoods, these are affluent African American enclaves, have fewer amenities than lower-income white communities. So if we talk about who's in the same boat, Prince George's County in Maryland, South DeKalb County in Georgia. These are the two most affluent, suburban, mostly African-American counties in the country. And they still don't have the amenities that would accrue. These are rich, pretty affluent. That would accrue to them given their income levels. And so even when African-Americans make it and move to the suburbs, and if the suburbs happen to be predominantly black, the kinds of things that these upper-income African Americans would assume they would have in terms of green space and full shopping and upscale this and upscale that, they don't have it. They don't have as much as if it were a lower middle-income white. So when you talk about the racism, it is institutionalized. And when you talk about the commercial redlining, and so it means, but what it means is that if you look at the migration pattern of the 40s and 50s and 60s, and the reverse when blacks were moving from the South to the North, and beginning in the 70s, blacks were moving back to the South. Right now, we're 57% of black people live in the South, in the southern cities. And there are southern cities now that are gaining the affluent and higher educated blacks who have moved from the Northeast and moving south. What we have to do, when I say we, is that we, as an academician and as a person who works on policy and works with black folks, is that we have to make sure that we capture the minds and the hearts of those affluent and highly educated in-migrants who are coming into the regions and coming to the cities, and many of them are not settling in the city, they're settling in the suburbs. And so, or in the outlying areas. So what we have to do is to get them back into our fold, and to understand that you may be out there in this affluent suburb, but your grandmother still is in the hood. The church is still in the hood. So there's still that connectivity. That we have to do a better job of doing that, and that's our job. There's nobody's job. That ain't white people's job. That's our job. Until we address the root of the problem, in terms of it's going to be because we got some suburbs. I live in the suburb, but hey, you could be you could be in North Birmingham. So, no. This is what happened. This is what happened when. This is research now. Go read some of these books that I've written. When you look at the fact that they're tearing down public housing, Hope 6, they're pushing poor people in the suburbs because the city is now becoming the in place. It's becoming in town, gentrified, live, work, play, code. Code meaning, we got a Whole Food store. Now we got a yuppie playground. Now you got white people walking dogs. The city now is becoming the place to be, and poor people, black people, are being pushed into those first ring, second ring suburbs, and so they're being pushed out, and the problems that came with the inner city neighborhoods before are being pushed out. There's no infrastructure in the suburbs. There's no transit, public transit in the suburbs. There's no, all those things. So the suburb, that first ring, is now becoming the inner city problem area, while the city now is becoming greener, cleaner, healthier, and whiter.
Yes, sir. Comments?
Dr. Cashin, Dr. Bullard, it's great to have you both today, and your remarks were very interesting, a lot of the points that you made. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about organizing communities for effective collective political action to protect these communities from institutionalized segregation. I wanted to pose a question to both of you, kind of in combination on the different points you both made. And my question is, how can we get urban centers, like for example the ones in North Birmingham, to become more diverse by attracting more people into those communities, perhaps by investing in schools to retrofit them so that they are greener? How can we attract businesses, local and state governments, to actually invest in those communities, to attract more diverse communities?
Well, this was the comment I wanted to make to the last little dialogue that Bob was having with the folks over here, but it's related to your point. That I wanted to underscore that what Gamaliel does, an area in about 50 metropolitan areas, their coalition goes beyond just the individual neighborhoods. Basically, they're forming regional-wide coalitions. But they figured out that the first ring older suburbs and the inner city, they have a lot more in common. And when the leadership of those two areas coalesce, they get to 51% in the state legislature, and then they can get things passed like more fair share affordable housing, or getting more of their fair share of transportation investments. You know, transportation and infrastructure investments tend to drive private investment. So you have to have your own neighborhood, you have to have your own block organized, you have to have your own neighborhood organized, you have to have your own community organized. But the real key to getting 51% power, which leads to allocation of resources that can fuel and drive investment, is to form coalitions that get across a region. And that it's labor intensive, it takes work, but it's helping, these various communities realize their common plights. And often these places are racially very different, but economically they're experiencing a lot of the same dilemmas. And what Gamaliel, and often with the consulting work of a guy named Myron Orfield, if you really want to get into this, read the two books written by Myron Orfield about this. What they do is, I lost my train, but they help these communities figure out that it's the outer ring suburbs that are getting more than their fair share of everything. They're getting more than their fair share of infrastructure dollars from the state. They're getting more than their fair share of transportation dollars. They're getting more than their fair share of the kinds of public policy allocations that drive development. And so until you really change the political dynamics of the region, you're gonna continue to have disinvestment and redlining, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me just piggyback. There's a book that I wrote in 2007, and Cheryl has a chapter in it. It's an MIT Press book, Growing Smarter, Achieving Livable Communities, Environmental Justice, and Regional Equity. And it was a project that was funded by the Ford Foundation, and we brought together a number of scholars, African-American scholars from around the country to Atlanta to look at these issues and to look at some of the solutions to look at some of these issues in various cities. Because what you're talking about in Birmingham is not unique. We have it even in Atlanta. But what we have in Atlanta, for example, are neighborhood planning units, NPUs. And these are planning units that for each neighborhood, and it was set up during model cities, and they have power and authority to develop their own individual plans and pass them on to the city, and the city has the authority to act on them. The idea is that a community, if North Birmingham is organized as a neighborhood, and if they can muster resources from wherever to develop a plan, just as if a plan was developed by UAB Planning Department. But it's a plan that the community developed in nice colors, and it looks, you know, nice dog and pony show, but it's solid. That plan can be taken and looked at and sold and marketed, whether it's affordable housing or whether it's dealing with the food security issue in terms of grocery stores, dealing with land use and zoning issues, dealing with the schools, dealing with health clinics, etc. A full plan that looks at all multifamily, single family, home ownership initiatives, code enforcement, the whole nine. If you have a neighborhood that will take that on and talk about developing a strategy to improve the quality of life, to spur development and investment, and it can take it, you know, to a bank, or if there's a black-owned bank that might see this as something that they could take on. There are lots of opportunities and there are lots of models that are out there, but there has to be some entity in the community that could take this on. I don't think it'll work if it's something that's external, put down and say, follow me, I know the way. I'm assuming there's a neighborhood association, a homeowner association, a civic club, church, you know, faith-based church schools or whatever, coming together and coming up with a plan for that area and move that plan from being a plan to implementation.
And often a community development corporation is a part of that and a driver in helping to connect to resources outside the community.
Yeah, UAB does not want to drive that. We don't want to. But we'll take a break now. We'll take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll invite the second panel. Thank you.